What's coming up next is a BOF, and it's about how to better describe software for discovery and citation. So Peter Teuben, Alice Allen, and Bruce Berriman will be leading this session. They will have they have co-host privilege, so they'll be able to bring up panelists. And so I'll be there to assist. But Peter, I see you're ready, so take it away.
Yeah, great. So here we are, how to better describe software for discovery and citation. And we've talked about that in the past many times. We're talking really about software metadata. How can we describe the software, and what is actually the software metadata besides, your tar, your zip, your GitHub repo that you have somewhere. This is what we're planning to do. We should have a little fun session today. We have prepared 7 little sessions of about 5 to 10 minutes each, and that should take about 45 minutes or up to. After each item, we will stop for a second and see if there's any discussion. I would suggest we use Discord. I've already seen earlier today, it's quite challenging to keep up with the Q&A and Discord, but I have people that can help me with that. So just interrupt me when I don't see something that we have to have somebody take the word. And then at the end, for the last 45 minutes, it'll be an open floor. I hope that some of our items will incite you to some more ideas, and then we will write them down and see what we do with that. So first of all, Scott, why do we want to do this session? Boom, there we go. Apart from being, a generic Google, where is what code and what can it do, there are registries like the ASCL and Zenodo, where you can search for your software. You can find it in ADS these days. You could rely on your noisy Google. But what we want to talk about today is the concept of how do we do this in the metadata, and what are the metadata. There is a link that I gave there by Spans that has a lot more background about making software findable, and it talks about these metadata. But we start with an example of how we can cite software in an example in montage. And then the next slide, I think, I will give the screen over to Bruce. Now, Bruce, are you going to just tell me when to advance, or how do we do that? We actually didn't test that.
Okay, the simplest thing would be for me to just tell you when to advance.
Sure, go ahead.
So, advance. Thank you. All right. Well, I was getting really desperate for entertainment during the pandemic, so I decided about a week ago to try an interesting experiment with Montage, which, as you know, is my software for creating image mosaics. It's been out in the wild for many years now, so I figured with all the work we put into it, all the metadata you need for software discovery and citation is readily available. So I went to the CITATION tool, this URL, you can see at the top there, put in the URL and let it search for the metadata and see what happens. So next slide, please, Peter.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to tell us what the metadata is?
It will come up.
Do I have to do another hit? What's going on here? Ah, yeah. One more?
Yep. Okay. This was very interesting. It gives you the citation at the bottom. It also apparently brings up the American Psychological Association, which is a bit of a mystery to me. Maybe it's a comment on my state of mind during the pandemic. I don't know. Next slide, please.
So that came up.
Yeah. Okay, so this is screenshots of the output from CITAS, and I'm going to go through them. It'll be, I think, the next 3 slides and see what it found. Well, it found okay, back to the previous one, please. Right, found the web page. It did not find a cite as relation header. It didn't find a DOI, even though we do actually have one. It didn't find an archive page, although we do have one of those as well. Next slide, please. It did find the GitHub repository. It didn't find the DOI in the GitHub page because it's not actually there. It's on the main web page. Again, in the GitHub, it didn't find a codemeta file because honestly, I've never created one yet. And it didn't find a link to a citation file because I never put one there. It did find a README file, which I think does contain some of that information. Next slide, please, Peter. All right. Again, didn't find a DOI in the README. It didn't find an R description file, but I don't think that's necessary for montage. It did find a API response, and it did find citation metadata. So this kind of shocked me to some degree. We've been working on this a long time, and quite a bit of the information that you need to cite and discover the software isn't there. So there's clearly work for me to do in that regard. So the next and last slide, please, Peter. So the question I set to myself and to us is, what are the recommended best practices in this area of creating metadata, data discovery and citation that software providers should be using? And I hope that we can be discussing this during this BOF. All right, so that's the end of my slides, and thank you for advancing, Peter.
Okay, you're welcome. And I want to again refer to Spaan's paper that I presented in Why We Do This Session, the Zenoda URL, where you can find a lot of background of some of the stuff that you see in the CITATION. So the next item is number 3 on our list, creating software metadata files from the ASCL entries. Because as you know, we have an ASCL registry, and it's no coincidence perhaps that the 3 speakers in the BOF are related to the ASCL. And Alice is going to tell us what she has discovered, or the services that she provides to help you with metadata.
Yep, so if you could advance to the next slide. I'm so glad that Bruce did his exercise and asks the question, because one of the ways that you can get your software cited correctly is to tell people explicitly how you want it done. And there are 2 metadata file formats that are now becoming very popular, or at least getting increased uptake over time for doing this. One is codemeta.json, and the other is citation.cff. These aren't the only ones out there, but they're the 2 that the ASCL creates. And as I said, they do have growing adoption, not just in astronomy, but also in other sciences. So if you, and obviously, CiteAs looks for these files and didn't find them on Bruce's site. So have we got a solution for him? So if you could hit the next, advance the slide, please.
But let me ask you a question. I remember that there's sort of the same thing in the same file, which is kind of confusing for users. Should they do both, or do we do this cross-walking thing, or are you going to talk about that particular issue?
I'm actually not going to talk about that. What I'm going to say is that these are two files. Citation.cff is only for citation. That it was made specifically for that. It's a YAML file, so it's in markup that's easy to read and easy to produce. CodeMeta is in JSON, is a little bit more complex and includes more information, including the citation information. So there is more that you can do or get into and out of a codemeta.json file. And both of these have been crosswalked to other schemas, such as schema.orgs. As a matter of fact, codemeta.json takes fields from schema.org, uses them, and then has added 10 additional fields that schema.org did not have, that better describes software. So it was a deficiency in schema.org that was seen, and the CodeMeta project started to try to fill in those blanks. So there's plenty of information. Those are both links. So there's plenty of information at those links and on the ASCL, and a workshop that we did a year ago that I can also link you to if you're interested. But what I really want to focus on is these are easy to produce if your code is in the ASCL. And even if it isn't, you can get a sample file from the ASCL that you can then edit for yourself. And that's what I want to show you. You don't need to go through the pain of learning how to do these on your own, because we've already gone through that pain for you. So go ahead and advance to the next.
Okay, here we are.
So these are metadata files on demand. All you have to do is add codemeta.json /codemeta.json or /citation.cff to an ASCL entry URL. This works only for codes that we've accepted, and it works only on the numbered URLs, the ones that have the ASCL ID embedded in the URL. These are intended to be a starting point as a help to the user, as a help to the code author, so that you can take these and put these on your own repo so you don't get results like Bruce got when trying to use CITATION, because CITATION does look for these. So go ahead and go to the next one. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So here's an example. We use Nemo as the example. Don't click on that link. I'll show you on the next slide.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to do the live demo here. You guys can do that on your own computers. So just go to the next slide. So that's what the URL looks like with the addition of the /codemeta.json. So this is all collapsed. You can hit enter one time, please, Peter. So this is all collapsed. So you can see what fields are there. We include fields that we don't have, such as license, because we want you to add that information to the codemeta.json file. That makes the file much more useful. We know from this morning's session the importance, or from the earlier session, whenever it was and whatever time zone you're in, how important the license is. A license lets other people know what they can and can't do with your software. And we encourage authors to add a license to their software. And if you create a CodeMeta file, please include that. So you see that there are placeholders here where there's information that we don't have. Advance, please.
Yep. Yeah.
So here you see that the citation that Peter has specified, or that the code authors for Nemo have specified, is a link to a paper. We actively seek out the preferred citation. And when I say preferred citation, I mean preferred by the code author. We want to include the way you want your code cited in a.
Oh, am I dead or is Alice dead?
Will show that. If you don't list a preferred citation when you create this file, we will just by default put in the ASCL entry URL saying cite with the ASCL ID, but we're not, and that's simply to put something in there. What we want you to do is put what you want in there. And if we don't have that information, please tell us what it is so we can add it. Go ahead and advance, please. So let's look at an example of citation.cff. You just add /citation.cff to the ASCL ID and you get advance. You get this. Notice that this is a little bit more readable, a little bit easier to write, and the citation is very clear at the top with message, please cite the following works when using this software. Bam, it's right there. It's very clear. So this is a YAML file. It doesn't have some of the other information, or doesn't allow the input of some of the other information that the CodeMeta file has in it, but it's easier. People generally find this easier to produce from scratch. And it's very clear what the intent is. This is for citation. And again, cite as looks for this. Let's go ahead and advance. So why do we have these? So this is not an exhaustive list, but they're good things to have because they let people know explicitly how to cite your software. I can't tell you how many times I look at a code site and I can't tell what is supposed to be used to cite that software. So I can't include that information on the ASCL because I can't find it. It also allows this information to be ingested in other systems, such as CITATION. And I just got an email from the manager of that project, in fact, while we were talking, because we have an API now where they can ingest our information more easily. And then with uptake, these file types are being used in other disciplines as well. So as uptake increases, we can create one ring, one search engine to rule them all. That it's possible, it would then be possible to pull in a lot of this information virtually off of GitHub repos or wherever these files exist, and then create some way to search across disciplines for software that may be useful to you. Next slide, please.
Before you go on, uptake is something I had never heard of. What is that? Is that
uptake, just getting people to use it.
Oh, it's all right. It's English, and then the word ring. What does the word ring with capital mean?
Does somebody know the reference that I'm making? One ring to rule them all. Lord of the Rings.
Oh, it's also English. I thought there were certain things that I never heard of.
No, it's not your doorbell.
So it's my cultural, yes, missing cultural experience. All right, next one. Sorry. Yeah, you get it?
So how do you get people to agree on one or two or three so that you can search across them? All of these two formats, codemeta.json and citation.cff and zenodo.json, which I believe is still going to morph into codemeta.json. They're actually going to give up their own zenodo.json and simply adopt the codemeta one because that's becoming an increasing standard. All of these and other competing formats for how to represent metadata in metadata for software have been crosswalked, and those crosswalk tables are on the CodeMeta site. So if you want to know what something is, what a field is in Zenodo and what it's called in CodeMeta, or what a field is in ASCL and want to know what it's called in CodeMeta, that's one place that you can look. Of course, it's always hard to get people to do something different. Well, maybe not always, but it is often hard to get them to do something different. So getting people to use a standard format, whatever that standard format is. What we've been doing is experimenting with actually sending these files out to code authors when we say, hey, we've registered your code. We're doing an A/B test where I send CFF and codemeta.files to the authors I write to. The other two editors do not send these files out, and at some point we'll do a comparison to see whether we've actually been able to trigger uptake of these by sending the files out. I hope the answer is yes, but we don't know for certain. I do know that some people have done it, but we want to compare sending them out and versus not sending them out. And of course, getting these files into other systems, they first have to be out there, and other systems have to, if they're not already looking for these, they have to start looking. We want them to start looking for these. So that's all I have. If you have questions about this, I'm happy to answer them. We have a new API as well. So if you want to pull additional information from the ASCL, such as preferred citation information, so that you can build another system to ingest that kind of information, we can do that. And I want to point out that the preferred citation we list comes straight from what you, the code authors, say on your own sites or within your software. We don't decide how your software should be cited. We take our cue from you. I'll also point out that there are, to get back to Bruce's last slide, there are software citation principles that have been written. A link to those is on an ASCL page, and I'll supply those links in the chat once I'm done talking, which is now. So thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions about that before we move on?
I don't see any open questions.
No.
Good, then we can go to item number 4, which, okay, this will be a surprise for me. I have no idea what's coming now. There was a licensing BOF this morning, and we decided, since we're also in some sense talking about licensing and discovery, if Jan, one of the people at the BOF, was going to say a few words, or maybe a super summary, what happened this morning for those who missed it. And, oh, there's a lot. Is Jan around to annotate this?
I think he's online.
Maybe the room manager can get him. Ah, he says he's coming. He said that at 2:10. Uh-oh.
Okay, well, one of the questions is Adrian Price-Whelan just wrote in and said, not a question, but I just started making a codemeta.json file for one of my projects. Yay!
Who do you want as a panelist?
Jan.
Yes, he just
With
showed up. Oh, somebody.
There he is.
There he is.
Yay.
Jan, do you see the slide?
I see the slide. Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent.
Yeehaw.
You want to give a nice quick summary of what you thought was interesting this morning?
Yes, so actually we try to make a summary, which we may actually also use on Thursday. So any feedback we have from this is great. So I think the summary, well, we first of all, we were completely surprised by the high attendance, like 120 people interested in licensing. We were all completely surprised. So we did notice, well, it's widely accepted that source licenses are a must nowadays. I think our main conclusion is that a lot of people, it's a no-brainer that you should pick a license, but what license to pick can sometimes be a complex discussion because, well, you're very seldomly actually working in projects that you do on your own. There's always external constraints, and these things can be complex. We noticed from our questionnaire that permissive licenses tend to be a bit more used than non-permissive ones. Even if you look at I did a bit of deeper diving into the data. If you look at people who actually do not follow their own institute's policies, those are a majority people who actually have a more permissive license than their institute. The questionnaire is anonymous, so I will not point out people here. I think that also the discussion we had on relicensing, that is very tricky business, that it's a very good idea to think in advance that software may actually live for like years and years in the future, and also to think about how to handle external collaborators. And I think that it's also clear there was some wish from the community to actually share best practices and learn from each other. And then I wanted to show the two main graphs from our questionnaire on the next slide. Yeah,
here it is.
So I think those are so I think the top graph shows basically what a typical license is that institutes have and collaborations have by policy. And on the bottom one, you actually see that how many people are actually using the type of license. So you already see that even though there are several, so there are a lot of people who don't really know whether the institute or collaboration actually has a policy at all. I think that's an interesting result there. Also, maybe actually referring back to the second BOF of today, which was talking about herding cats. And again, you see that the permissive licenses are I think, quite popular in our field. I think those are the two main things you could immediately say based on the images. Also, there was a lot of discussion that we could, I'm adding it already as next year's ADASS. I mean, we could easily fill a next BOF with all the questions we still are open. I think an important one was data licensing, and I think this may also apply a bit to this discussion. that data citation, data licensing, that whole package is also something that people are very interested in, and well, of course, is also getting a lot of attention nowadays. Contributions and contributors. How do you handle those? How do you deal with them? Also the establishment and also importantly the enforcing of guidelines, and especially on licensing. How do you enforce your license at all? I think is also a question that I saw a lot of times also in the questionnaire, and was also well, in our ranking. And well, of course, actually that already links back to the last point I made on the previous slide on the collaboration and the community-based approach on how, as a community, we can learn from each other and get our well, things sort of well, that we can learn from each other. And I think during the prep call I had with Alice there, we very shortly discussed how, for example, licenses are actually in the whole codemeta kind of world, or how you would put them in, and the two formats that you just discussed. And I think I think it's very typical that there doesn't really seem to be a standard way to describe your licenses in your file. So there is a field in the code meta that describes your license, but as we didn't really very quickly find whether there's a easy way to do it, and so ASCL basically puts in a placeholder. And I think that in itself is an interesting point to make, that it's not completely aligned yet, the world of licensing and metadata, I guess. But that was not a conclusion of the BOF. That's my conclusion from the preparation to this BOF.
Oops. All right, thank you, Jan. Any questions on that?
And of course, that URL is the page with all the info that we...
Yeah. So before I go on to the next item, Alice already showed the codemeta file, codemeta.json, and the citation.cff. That's sort of more into what Jan just talked about. But we should also say codemeta.json also includes the citation. So that's probably the preferred one. Adrian just already went through the exercise. He went to his code, apparently. I think that is on ASCL, and he created one. You can then put that in your GitHub and annotate it more with more information, like what I did. And there was actually a question, I think, on the what happens with that file. Will ASCL take that over? The plan is yes, but I don't think that's active yet. But I wanted to add something to that, and namely, if you have a codemeta.json file in the root directory of, for example, your GitHub directory, GitHub repo, then there will be search engines that will find that. And so I was at a workshop that we had at Maryland about that. Now that's not fully clear to me how functional that is, but this is something that works across all fields, you know, geology, physics, biology, and astronomy, and so forth and so on. And so with that search engine, you can then search through all kinds of fields and look for software. So the obvious thing that came up to me is, as well, you know, let's take my example of Nemo. You know, who cares that it's a dynamics toolbox for whatever. There's not much information in there of the kinds of things that it does. So I discussed with some people at that meeting how can we deepen the code meta, because if you look at that file, it's sort of one level deep most of the time. But if you take, for example, a package like IREF or APES or Nemo or Myriad and so forth and so on, once you go one level deep, you suddenly have 100 commands, and they do all kinds of interesting things. So if you could grep, quote unquote, through that, you might discover quite a lot of interesting things about a code, a package. What are the subroutines in CFITS.io that are related to opening a bin table? Or are there tools in Nemo that work on a bin table? And you would never find that with only the top level, but if you go one level deeper, you could find that. All right, so that was sort of an exercise I did at that particular meeting. So that's what this slide goes about. Some years ago, we had code.google.com. I actually discovered only today that it's still there, but it's hidden in a subdirectory, in a sub-branch. So there's code.google.com/archive. I didn't probe around how well they maintained that, but it's basically, it seems like a dump from 2016 when Google stopped doing that. But I remember at the time it was very interesting, and I could find all kinds of interesting, functions that do this or that, and but it's very laborious to find your code that way. So the JSON, the codemeta.json does have an option, and that's really from this thing that I labeled there in number 4, called schema.org. And if you go in there in the software application, you can find many, many items how you can describe your software, of which codemeta.json only takes a fairly small portion of it. And this is this crosswalk that we talked about, what matches the things in schema.org related to software to what goes in codemeta.json. Alice can explain to me if that's a proper way of putting it, but there's a lot more items in schema.org than we currently have in codemeta.json. And the one thing that is missing is things like keywords. And this thing that I have as an example here at the bottom of this slide is the task list, or whatever we call it. But it would basically be a list of the name of the function or the program and what it does. And then that upper level search engine that goes all the way across all our fields, all our science fields, is then able to find across the fields things that you're interested in. So I actually have an example. I built that. It turned out to be super simple in Nemo to organize that task list, and it's completely automated. So I could automatically update this extremely simply in my codemeta.json file. So that was one way how you could expand your code meta. I mean, it's of course not accepted. There's a whole committee that goes over this, but that would be an interesting expansion that we haven't really worked on a lot. But so that was one. And that sort of segues into the Unified Astronomy Thesaurus that I worked a little bit with Katie on, who is a part of this group. So that's the UAT, and formerly known as the IEU Thesaurus, I guess. And there's a bunch of them, and they were unified in a thesaurus. And if you go to the top of your typical science paper, you see the keywords, right? And you see some example there at the bottom in yellow. I took just some random 3 papers that had to do a little bit with codes, and they're just words or quasi sentences that are separated by semicolons. And if you remember that from the old times, it was often word, colon, and then some, other words that belongs to that. It was a slightly different structure. And the AAS and other journals have now standardized on that. And these are the words that you can find as the leaf notes in the AUT. That is, it's been adopted by the AAS. You can find it on GitHub if you go to that link that I gave in item number 2. And those leaf notes that you see there in yellow, you can find in that particular in those particular papers. And like they have 3 versions of the thesaurus. There is one as a CSV file, and there's 2 other files that are less easy to read. So what I talked about before, these keywords, can we use that also in codemeta.json, right? So then it turns out, I found out that a number of, if you go, for example, especially to astronomy and computing, they use a different set of keywords that are catching the software better, the kind of the algorithms, for example, that are not caught in the UAT. So that gave me an argument to say, well, we need to expand the UAT, of which, of course, they're happy to do, to catch more of the things that we are interested in covering, software and algorithms. And on the next slide, I have some examples. So in yellow is, again, the examples that we just saw from a bunch of paper that I took from AppJ or an AAS blessed journal. And at the bottom, there's just some random examples from ANC. And you can see that that is the sort of sometimes the old style galaxies : photometry, methods : data analysis. And those are, of course, maybe the old style, or I don't know where they get it from. But if you just grab through the AUT, most of them are not in the AUT. There's no match on FITS, for example, or World Coordinate System. Let me go back to this slide. Let me see what I want to say else about this. Then I wanted to go to an example to get a better census. Oh, that's misspelled. The other census I meant. If you take, for example, the field of stellar dynamics, and let me just go to that slide. A good example would be to look at a niche at a small field, stellar dynamics and stellar populations. They happen to have a meeting coming up next month and a follow-up meeting a year from now. So that would be a great opportunity to get some domain experts in one room or one virtual room, and with them decide on what is a good census of the software that is used in that field and what are the keywords that we need to describe that particular software to add in our additional AUT. So that's an idea I have. I was planning to go to that meeting and bring this up in a session and see if we can get these people to think and work on that in the next year and present this next year at ADASS, presumably, but also at their meeting, which they have in November 2021. I think this is in Australia. So that is, yes, that is it in terms of the deepening what we can do with codemeta.json and how we can help discovering our software in a better way. Okay, so Alice, I hope I didn't lie too much when I talked about these crosswalks.
You think I was listening to you?
Oh, that's okay.
I've been like posting links. So
if you, I presume I talked about this workshop that we had. I think we have a blog about that, isn't that so?
I'm about to post the link. I just pulled up the link.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking about that. So if you want to know more about that, what the other fields are doing in terms of that, because yeah, it's nice if you make your codemeta.json file, but you know, where does it go? Where does the information go? Who grabs it? So there's a lot more in there. But as I said, I don't know quite the status of what happened after that meeting with all of these ideas.
Right now we're working on best practices and a quick ref guide for repositories, and registries that were there. I mean, this was a broad cross-disciplinary meeting, so we got people from all over, lots of different disciplines in. We had somebody from CITATION, somebody from Zenodo, which you can see if you look at the participants list. We pulled these people together because we don't talk to one another. I mean, overall, people who do what I do in another field, or people who, you know, work on, I mean, I do talk to Zenodo people, but I wanted to talk to other people who kind of do what I do, and we had this workshop that was great, and we're working on something to release by the end of the year on policies, best practices, or quick start guide to services like us. And
so, so this group is still regularly meeting, Alice?
No, it hasn't. Well, it hasn't been meeting. Hasn't been meeting very much during the pandemic. So,
yeah, I know before you did, but
yes, but we had been holding monthly meetings. We actually were holding, and when we start up again, we'll hold 2 meetings a month. They're both on the same day, and the reason we have 2 is because we're around the globe. So we get some people at the early meeting in the day. We have it at 11 a.m. Eastern, and then we have another one at 6 p.m. Eastern on the same day, and that allows us to go through our to-do list more quickly, because we do, you know, the people in the first meeting do some, and then the people in the second meeting follow up on that and do more. So there's a lot going on with metadata. That there's an RDA meeting going on now, so where metadata is much discussed, both on data and software.
mm-hmm.
There's just a lot going on in these different areas.
I thought that was a fascinating example of cross-fertilization going on at that meeting. There was a guy from Amsterdam, and he had taken this project that came from astronomy. It's called AMUSE, And AMUSE, which you can find on ASCL, it's a project that is basically a Python hub that collects all the data structures and code in legacy code. So it takes an n-body code from like RSETH and maybe an Eggleton stellar evolution code and a hydrodynamics code from this. And in the Python hub, you can then tweak which components you want. And you can then, for example, evolve a star cluster with stellar evolution, with gas in it, and all the dynamics on the different time scales, and do that all correct. And that idea of this Python hub with these legacy codes like spokes around it that you can still reuse in Python, because Python doesn't do the computation. That's all done by the legacy code. Python is just the orchestrator to take the time steps. So there was a group that took that from Amsterdam, and I believe it was hydrology. I don't know if you remember that, but they took that whole project and took that whole idea and took their legacy codes and took the infrastructure from AMUSE and wrote a very successful package that was basically cloned. I was extremely impressed with that.
Yeah, so there was a lot going on in that meeting, and there still is. So we're still in touch. Somebody from Software Heritage was also there, and I mean it was
yeah. So you can find information on that on the blog. So I think we're basically done with the things we wanted to share with you. If I look at the clock, we have spoken for, is that 45 minutes? Wow, that's a pretty good estimate. One idea we already have, which I put myself already on number 8, is to, of course, we're going to have a little write-up about this BOF, which is limited to 4 pages. The licensing BOF will do something similar. And we thought that it might be useful if we write some of these best practices and codemeta.net, all of these things we talked about today, to have that in a little white paper that people can use and just learn about how they should make their software better discoverable and properly cite. I know we've spoken about that at the AES and at various other times, even at ADASS. But it doesn't hurt to have that in a bigger write-up. So maybe we will turn this into a white paper. Who knows? So that was number 1, and I think we should open the floor and see if there's any other items that people want to either present or ask questions about to any of us or the others. Nuria gives me 1 thumb up to the white paper idea.
We want to make sure that we're not duplicating what's already out there. There are the software citation guidelines that are out there. There's a lot of information on licensing. So
yeah, but people, well, obviously there'll be just references, but I suspect there's lots of people that don't know about these references, where they are.
I mean, one part of the white paper, if we do it, would be maybe to have, excuse me, 2 or 3 worked examples from different types of software that show how these metadata examples are created and what they look like.
Yeah.
But that would involve, several people being willing to do it. I'd certainly be willing to help out on that one if we went that route. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also discussed the fact that this example of the task names is not in codemeta.json, right? And I have a feeling that this might be a very useful thing. The question, of course, is that how difficult is it to maintain that? It could be complex.
Yeah, I was going to ask that very question.
Yeah, now if you have, in my case, I wrote a little shell script that you can find that in my GitHub repo. It turns out to be extremely simple to do that in Nemo, but it depends completely how your package was written, right? If you have something like cfits.io, and if you wanted to do that, well, maybe you need a parser for the, you need one-liners for every subroutine and function in cfits.io. And it's optional, if you don't do it, then you don't get it. And it would have to be ratified and understood by the people that write parsers to help you search these codemeta.json files. So it's not there yet, but I would like the idea that exists as an option. Okay, I'm going to read some of these. Alice is already answering some of those.
So an interesting question came up that I now can't find because things are scrolling so quickly. Oh, so as a simple example, what do we do about closed source packages? Well, of course, ideally, we would want them to be open source, but even if they're not, the metadata for them can still be made available. You can still find out what the name is, how it's licensed, what kind of work it does, and all of that. So there's still a lot of closed source.
So where are these codemeta.json files stored?
They could be stored, wherever information about the code exists.
Right, so on IDL's website or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember that we talked at the workshop about having these registries. It reminded me a lot on how the IVOA operates, because you have geology that has a server that knows where all of their code meta files are, and servers, and they need to talk to each other. And so that sounds a little bit like an IVOA concept.
Maybe it's something to discuss at the IVOA meeting next week.
Yeah, I think we sort of brought this up once, and with Bob Hanisch, and he didn't seem too hot on this, but maybe it's time to reconsider this. Yes. I'll see if I can remember that. Are you going to be there, Bruce?
I will be attending, yeah. There is a working group that is responsible for these issues. So I would tend to think it's a very good time to bring it up again.
Yeah. I remember Bob was a little, he was worried, I think, about the maintenance of metadata, or not clear how well you can describe that.
I'm sorry, if memory serves, I think he was concerned with the metadata becoming rapidly out of date as the versions advance, and how would that be handled? And I don't think at the time, which was a number of years ago, of course, I don't think at the time there really was a good answer to that. I don't think anyone had given a tremendous amount of thought to it.
Well, if you store it on the GitHub repo in the root directory, the author ought to make them consistent. It's like keeping your documentation consistent with your subroutines and so forth.
Yes.
And I happen to have a mechanism in Nemo where the code contains the one-liner. So when I update the code, automatically those one-liners get updated. And so in my case, the syncing is trivial. It's just part of the building process.
Yeah. So something to put in the white paper.
Yeah, I listed the name of the function, so I'll remind myself that should go in the white paper. But yeah, that's a good idea. Let's discuss that next week. And then there's also the issue, I remember, that I ran into, what astronomy and computing does for keywords, because they don't seem to be using the UAT. And I don't know if there's any of the board members here present, but I would guess that the keywords that we have in the UAT are just not sufficient for astronomy and computing, and they stick to something older. So if that's not the case, we should really talk to the UAT people and go through the process of a census of software and finding a better description of our software on that level.
Peter, the discussion is wild on Discord. Do you want to open the floor to some of the attendees if they want to talk?
Yeah, I think people should just raise their hand and then also talk.
I can help out.
We're recording. I agree. I'm having a hard time following everything, although I see that Alice is really heavily answering things. So people
I'm
should just
trying.
raise their hand and I'll give them speaking permission.
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting is that Peter Williams just asked. So then the plan will be to have a central location for that metadata. And I was just typing my response to that as well. That could be one result if people put a metadata file on their code sites, whatever code site that is, or make it available, then there could actually be something that would go out and build a registry or a central location for that metadata. It could be done automatically, and if information is added as to the domain, for example, which discipline this comes from, you could it opens up a whole new world of discovery, because there are codes that are useful in medical imaging that are useful for astronomy, and vice versa. There are astronomy codes that are being used to analyze MRIs of knees, for example. There are these cross-disciplinary uses of the research software that is available out there in the world. But how many people in astronomy are going to go look through medical imaging code to find something useful? Whereas, you're not going to do that explicitly, but if you have some way to capture metadata about all these different software packages, then you have an opportunity to build something that can search across all of them too.
Yeah, I'm getting another plug for doing, do we see some hands? I was just looking at the sample that I have. I see code repository, of course, but there is no guarantee. Let's say that this file is going to live by itself. Somebody stole it, puts it in a database. Now, how does that database know that it has to sync it to make sure that I didn't make an update, right?
Can I mention a few things here?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is Peter Williams. Yeah, I guess just sort of what was prompting some of the questions that I've been asking with some of this stuff is I think exactly this question of, from what I've seen of how the web works, metadata don't automatically self-organize. You need these kinds of central hubs to really spur people to actually fill in their metadata correctly. And when you get duplication and when you get, when you don't have that kind of, people write their metadata files such that they show up correctly on, such that Google indexes their websites correctly or whatever it might be. And so I guess as I've thought about this more, I tend to convince myself that really that end of the equation of like, what's the hub that everyone goes to? And for me, I feel like the question is, okay, you're a working stiff scientist, you want to cite CASA, how do you get from that to BibTech? That seems like the hub that things should be going through. And I feel like, once we have that hub, then the metadata will kind of figuring out how to organize that will become a lot simpler in a certain sense, because that will sort of orient our thinking about how everything should be gathered and organized.
No, it's this is Thomas Jürgens. It's like a robot, right? Like a Google robot that harvests information from sites. That's what you need, right? So if everybody puts their citable metadata in their repositories, you just search through the repositories and grab the contents of these files. Then you store that in a database. You eliminate duplicates, and Bob's your uncle. Suddenly you have a database that is full of the information that you want, right? Cross-referencing the citable information with the location where the code can be found, right? Then you put that on some central web page, make it searchable, and then you have created your central location for exactly that.
Right, and as these types of files are increasingly used, of course, something like Google is going to search them because it's useful for them. That helps people find what they're looking for if there are some standards to how this information is formatted.
And also the IVOA has had a registry of services for many years. Why not also have a registry of software?
Yeah, the problem that
Yeah.
I see with registries is that first, people have to know about them, and secondly, people are lazy, right? So do I spend half an hour? Do I spend half an hour of time to register my code someplace, or do I just do anything else to improve my code or bug fix or service a user request or such things, right? So if this can be automated, we take that responsibility, that burden out of the hands of our software developers and make it easy.
But I guess the point that I want to make is that creating that database is not an automatable process. I mean, you know, some of us work close to the folks at ADS, or, you know, knowing people who work at Google, like, you know, the Google search box looks like it's just magically slurping things and organizing them the way you want. But there is a lot of effort that goes into doing that synthesis and removing all the duplicates and keeping everything up to date. And, you know, there's just, that database is actually super hard to create. And honestly, that might be harder than, you know, once that database exists, people will populate it if they see the path to do it. But without that database, there isn't really going to be the North Star that guides people as to how to organize their metadata and where to put them.
Well, that initial database could be the first step, right? The stepping stone that is necessary, the kickoff, right? Incentives gives the incentive to everybody to really contribute to that database, right? I mean, look around in the commercial world, right? Once Google actually started harvesting information from web pages for advertisement reasons, people started paying Google to get into that database, right? So what I'm trying to say is, well, you need to have something first so that people see the reason why they want to contribute to it.
Yeah, and I think the idea that I have is I feel like a sort of Wikipedia kind of model of, you know, I think having a really low barrier to entry where people can add an item or propose updates to an item, like with super, honestly, low supervision, is probably the kind of way to think about how to bootstrap that kind of effort.
I think all of the ASCL data has been wiki-dated, if I can make that a verb. I haven't done it. I've not been involved in that, but all of our data is available publicly, and I will put the link. Well, I'll tell you, it's ascl.net/code/JSON. That will give you all of our public data. So that can be used for good. Don't do evil things with it. But that's, you know, and there is a lot of software metadata around of course in astronomy, because there are numerous different ways to get it. Of course, ADS has a doc type software, so you can search ADS specifically for software entries by doing doc type :software, and that will get you, it's mostly Zenodo and ASCL records, but increasing. You know, we're happy to create them where we can so that you can use them, but our next trick is our next goal is to, when you make a request for a metadata file for either codemeta.json or citation.cff from the ASCL, we want to check to see not update their metadata ever. And we may have more up-to-date metadata than what is currently on somebody's site.
Alice, I just lost you for 10, 20 seconds. Is that just me or did everybody?
Yes, my audio is cutting out. Sometimes
yeah,
my
okay,
internet,
okay.
connection is unstable because I'm running, 3 phones and 2 laptops, and I don't have very robust services. So sorry about that.
So then the first idea would be to harvest the initial data set from ASCL.
You can do that, and we have a new API. We have a poster that we're presenting. Our Sita Mavram is presenting a poster at ADASS on our new API. We've just made this available publicly, so you can actually go out and search for everything that does not have a preferred citation. And if your code is on that list, please let us know what your preferred citation is. But then
poster P9103. I mentioned it in one of the first slides.
Yep.
And that's simple JSON files, so you could even grab them yourself and then write your little parser to it, because you can just absorb them and query them. But the idea is, I don't know how far they are with that, of actually providing web services for this online somewhere that we can search through certain disciplines where we register, like, for example, here's all the ones from astronomy and so forth and so on.
Well, we're working with other disciplines to try to do the same thing. One of the things that happened at the workshop a year ago was encouraging these other repositories and registries to do the same thing that the ASCL is doing, which is creating these metadata files for their code authors. And I know that several other disciplines have decided, yes, they're going to do that. And they'll encourage their authors to put these files on their code repos as well. Because I really see that's where this idea gets really powerful. Standard metadata improves, makes it possible to do so many really interesting things, most of which I can't even think of because I'm just not, that clever. But you all are, so I know you will think of really cool things to do with it.
Yep. Okay. Peter still has his hand up, but other than that, I don't see it. Yeah, thank you. You still have privilege to talk, by the way, both Thomas and Peter.
I was wondering how hard it can be actually to write a small spider script that goes through all GitHub repositories. I mean, GitHub should have an API, right, that allows me to search for certain file names.
Yes, it has exactly that. You can do that kind of thing.
You can do that quite easily, but the thing is, there's probably going to be 0.01% astronomy in there. But if you just want to have
it's a start,
a wider
right?
field, yeah.
Just to see if that's a kind of a working idea, right? I mean, just to get going. I mean, then it needs some iterations, of course, and the solution has to be turned into something really useful. But just the initial step to get going, to get some traction.
Would that work, you think?
I don't know. I'm optimistic.
I think there's you give it like file name : that, or there's some way to search for files with a particular name,
like they do in ADS. it can be done.
Yeah, you see at the bottom of your screen with this file name. In the code options.
Yeah. Yeah, these are examples. Okay. I still don't know how to have to prefix that.
I think you can just fill it in and then, or
Yeah,
no.
just
that's
type
what I
in the
did.
file name.
You should type it
That's
in.
what
It
I
will.
did. That's what I did before, but that don't.
I
Oh,
think now you
oops.
can use the advanced options and extend your search with them. So I guess you have to search for star or whatever and then click on. So if you empty this box and you fill it in the file name box downstairs.
See, I only get 5. On wikis.
Jan just posted the search and it returned 1,181 code results that contain the file name codemeta.json.
Yeah.
So that's
Okay,
promising.
that's better.
Jan, you are my hero.
Oh, file name. Okay, file name colon.
Took me 3 bots for someone to say that. Thank you.
All right. Well, Alice, we have more codes in the ASCL than that.
Yes. So as I said, we've been experimenting with how to improve uptake, and one way of these, of codemeta.json and or citation.cff, and one way to do that is to present at conferences like ADASS and get everybody listening to put these files on their GitHub repos or wherever their code exists, because you've been to this BOF. So,
and can you
so
see who's the first one in that list?
Well, Adrian Price Whelan wrote in while we were talking about it that he
Oh, no,
was
no, no.
on
I
that-
meant on the GitHub search. Look,
Oh.
look who's number 1 on that list. Is it too small?
Well, I'm not looking at it right now, but
Oh, well, I'll give it away. It's Mike Hucka.
oh, Mike Hucka. So yes, so Mike Hucka is works in
Caltech.
biological
Caltech.
modeling.
Yeah. He's at Caltech.
Sorry, he's at Caltech, and he is one of the people working on these policies for code repositories, because he runs one for systems biological language system SBLM, I think SMLB. So he runs that, and he's currently creating a way to create code metadata files from the metadata that is in that particular resource, which he set up. So this is, again, somebody from another field who, we've talked to and we're working with. Actually, Caltech was received the funding for the workshop that Peter and I have both mentioned that was a year ago. So we partnered with Caltech, with these people in systems biology, to put on the workshop. They received the funding and it got put on at University of Maryland.
Oh, this one is a little bit more filled out. Oh, this one even mentions the funding they got.
So yeah, that's another thing that's a schema.org field, or or set of fields for funders.
All right, quite interesting. So now you've learned all about codemeta.json.
Maybe not all about it, but certainly enough to build your own codemeta.json files. There are also systems out there. CodeMeta, if you go to codemeta.json, they have something that will help you create a codemeta file. So does CITATION.cff. And there are other generators out there as well. But you could just use the ASCL and then augment and edit that file too. That makes it easy. And as I said, we worked with the creators of both of those formats to make sure that we were doing it correctly. They were both at the meeting last year too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm ready for a beer.
I'm ready for 2.
I have 4 in the fridge here, so you're welcome.
So we're meeting at Peter's.
No. This was 1 beer for every end of the day. That's why I have 4. Ah, the parcel tongue has now also. Mark is the second one. Well, shall we wrap it up? We still have 15 minutes on the clock, but
Well, but
yes, everybody's happy to
can I
stop
throw
by
out a
here.
question to everybody else?
Yeah, of course.
Is there something that we could do, you know, either through the ASCL or through this larger workshop group, you know, of code repositories and registries that attended the workshop or are involved in the workshop activities from last year? Is there something else that we could do to make things easier, to make it easier for you to create these files or use these files, to convince people in your institutions to create them? Or is there some other way? Is there some way that we could help? Or do you have ideas for other ways to improve adoption of these metadata files? Oh, please have ideas.
There did seem to be quite a bit of interest in doing a white paper. Although, you know, it's one more task for people to do and everyone is already very busy. I would certainly be willing to contribute to such a document if we think that that is a very good thing to do. Or maybe it doesn't need to be a white paper. It can be a web page somewhere containing the same content.
Mm-hmm. But when we say white paper, presumably you want to put that in archive.
That would be the idea. Although practices tend to change, and so a white paper would presumably go out of date fairly quickly, I would suspect, and therefore maybe a web page that could be kept up to date might be a better solution. Although again, that requires work for the maintenance and the updates.
So Alice, do we
Bruce,
we have the blogs on ASCL. Do we have static pages that we could edit and update as the practices change? Kind of like a wiki?
Well, perhaps a versioned white paper.
Mm-hmm. That would work too.
Yeah. Well, the proceedings paper is already on Zenodo, and once that has been submitted to Francesco and company, we can just uplift it and make it the white paper all the infrastructure is there. So let's do the proceedings paper. That's only a week of work, right? And then we'll just go from there.
Well, it's a day of work and 6 days of cussing at LaTeX.
That's certainly my
No.
experience.
Not an overleaf.
That's true. Overleaf makes things much better.
It's already in there. I have the link for you, Bruce. So that's the nice thing about the personalized templates that we have for ADASS. If you, it's not automated, but it's just 1 or 2 extra steps, and what you get from the lock, you can stuff it pretty easily into Overleaf and then just work from there.
Yes, I've done that with my 2 papers for this conference, and yes, it's a good idea.
It's too bad that we cannot submit from Overleaf to ADASS, right? You have to grab it again, make it a zip file, and then give it a certain name, and then so that step is still a little manual.
But you're on the park, right? You could maybe change that.
Maybe I'll see if we can do that in Cape Town.
So Peter, are you done?
I think so. You were very quiet there.
Yes. Well, I'm just here to assist. The boss is the lead.
I think we're done. There's a lot of things to mull over in the chat. That's good. I couldn't really keep up with that.
So people, you can continue the discussion on Discord.
Yeah, in this room, we will monitor what's going on and then go from there.
Excellent. So this is the end of this session. And the next session is tomorrow for many of you, this evening for me. So we have 9.5 hours to break, to work, to sleep, to whatever. And we'll see you then.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.